share your planet with another kind of human. Not a myth, not a fossil. A living, breathing person. Shorter than you. Broader than you. With a face that juts forward like a cliff face and a brain just as large as yours. Maybe larger. For most of human history, this was not a thought experiment. This was Tuesday. For roughly 400,000 years, Neanderthals and your ancestors shared Europe and Western Asia. They hunted the same megafauna. They sheltered in the same cave systems. They buried their dead. They made tools. They made jewelry. They may have made music. And then, around 40,000 years ago, they were gone. But what if they weren't? What if, instead of vanishing, Neanderthals simply continued? What does the evidence actually tell us about who they were, and what the world would look like if they had never disappeared? To answer that, you first have to abandon almost everything you think you know about them. The word Neanderthal has become an insult. Slow, brutish, a synonym for someone who can't keep up. That reputation is wrong. The fossil record is unambiguous. Neanderthals were not evolutionary dead ants stumbling toward extinction. They were sophisticated, they were adaptive, and they were, in a very real sense, us. The first Neanderthal remains were discovered in Germany's Neander Valley in 1856, just 3 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species. The timing was unfortunate. Scientists were primed to see hierarchy in nature, and Neanderthals were immediately slotted into the bottom rung, primitive, subhuman, barely a step above the apes. That framing stuck for over a century. Then the genetics arrived and blew the whole story open. In 2010, geneticist Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology sequenced the first complete Neanderthal genome. What they found changed everything. Modern humans outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. That is not contamination. That is not rounding error. That is the genetic record of real interbreeding, of Neanderthal men and women having children with your ancestors. And those children surviving and passing those genes forward to you. You are not fully Homo sapiens. You never were. Some of those inherited genes are functional right now. They influence your immune system. They affect your risk of certain diseases. Some researchers believe Neanderthal DNA helped modern humans adapt to new climates when they first pushed into Europe. Your body contains a blueprint that is partially theirs. So who were they, really? Neanderthals first appeared roughly 400,000 years ago in Europe and Western Asia. They were cold-adapted, stocky, barrel-chested, with shorter limbs to conserve heat. Their faces were dominated by a massive projecting nose. Wide nasal passages ideal for warming cold air before it hit the lungs. Their brow ridges were heavy. Their skulls were long and low. But their brains, on average, were the same size as yours. Possibly slightly larger. They made what archaeologists call Mousterian tools, a sophisticated toolkit named after the site of Le Moustier in France. These were not crude rocks smashed together. They were carefully shaped scrapers, points, and hand axes made through a controlled flaking process that required planning, knowledge, and practice. You could not pick up a flint and replicate one without training. At the site of Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, archaeologist Ralph Seletsky excavated Neanderthal burials in the 1950s and 1960s. He found evidence suggesting flowers had been placed with the bodies, a discovery that sparked decades of debate. Whether the flowers were ceremonial or simply carried in by burrowing animals remains contested. But the burials themselves are not. Neanderthals prepared their dead for something. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, researchers found perforated shell ornaments with traces of pigment dated to at least 115,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in Europe. Neanderthals were wearing jewelry before we were. They used ochre and manganese dioxide, dark pigments, and cave paintings in Spain at Ardales Cave and La Pasiega have been dated by uranium-thorium methods to over 65,000 years ago. A time when only Neanderthals lived there. The shapes are simple, dots, lines, hand stencils, but the intention is unmistakable. They were communicating something. They wanted to leave a mark. Now imagine that mark never stopped. If Neanderthals had survived, if the collision with modern humans had not ended in their absorption or extinction, what does the world look like? Let's reconstruct the most plausible version. The leading theory for Neanderthal disappearance is not a war. It is not a massacre. It is a slow demographic erosion. Researcher Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London has argued for decades that Neanderthals were already living in small, fragmented populations when modern humans arrived. Their numbers were thin. Their groups were isolated. When modern humans pushed into Europe with larger social networks, more sophisticated long-distance trade, and possibly a more flexible spoken language, the competitive pressure was quiet but relentless. Neanderthals did not lose a battle. They lost a census. If that pressure had not arrived, if modern humans had been slower to migrate, or if Neanderthals had held a population advantage in key territories, you might be living in a world where two cognitively sophisticated human species coexisted into the present. Would they have merged? Probably yes. Gradually. The interbreeding that happened over tens of thousands of years of overlap tells you that contact was not always hostile. In many cases, it was intimate, in a world where both populations remained large enough to sustain themselves. What you'd likely see is not two rigidly separate species but a continuous spectrum of variation, some populations more Neanderthal in morphology, some more sapiens, and most somewhere in the middle. Taxonomically, the concept of species gets complicated here. Many researchers argue that Neanderthals were not a separate species at all, that they should be classified as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, a subspecies of us. The genetic evidence of viable offspring with modern humans supports this. You can only hybridize across a species boundary with difficulty, and usually without producing fertile offspring. Neanderthal and modern human offspring were fertile. That is the definition of the same species. In a world where Neanderthals survived, this question would have been resolved not by paleontologists in a lab but by daily human reality. By the kids in the valley who grew up with both kinds of grandparents. But there are harder questions here. Neanderthals were adapted to cold. Their entire physiology was tuned to Ice Age Europe. If the Holocene, the warm period that began about 12,000 years ago and that you are still living in, had still arrived, Neanderthal populations in lower latitudes would have faced real pressure. The megafauna they relied on, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, were already in decline before modern humans arrived, driven partly by climate and partly by hunting pressure from both species. A surviving Neanderthal population might have followed the cold northward, into Scandinavia, into Siberia, or they might have adapted, as so many human populations have, by changing their diet, their territory, and their tools. The evidence from sites like Vindija Cave in Croatia suggests late Neanderthals were already showing behavioral flexibility, incorporating some modern human tool technologies. Possibly through trade or direct contact. They were not static. They could learn. They could change. Now ask yourself the question that sits underneath all of this. If two intelligent, tool-using, symbol-making, child-bearing human species had survived into the Holocene, into agriculture, into cities, into the era of organized power, how would one have treated the other? The historical record of what modern humans have done to other modern humans, to populations they perceived as different or inferior, does not inspire optimism. Researcher and anthropologist Agustin Fuentes has written extensively about the deep entanglement of cooperation and conflict in human evolutionary history. We are capable of extraordinary compassion within groups and extraordinary violence across them. A world with Neanderthals would have been a world where that boundary, between us and not quite us, was visible in a face, in a brow ridge, in a slightly different gait. History suggests that visible difference has rarely protected a population from the worst of human behavior. The most honest answer to, what if Neanderthals survived, is not a utopia of human diversity. It is probably a more complicated version of the world you already have, with another group of people fighting for the same resources, the same recognition, The same right to define what human means. And here is the thing that should stop you cold. You already carry the answer inside you. That 1 to 4%. Those Neanderthal genes in your immune system. The cold adapted variants that let some of your ancestors survive European winters. In the most literal biological sense, Neanderthals did not go extinct. They were absorbed. They live inside you right now. The extinction was not a deletion. It was a merger. And the next time someone uses the word Neanderthal as an insult, as a shorthand for slow, for primitive, for not quite evolved enough, you can tell them the truth. Those genes are in your blood. They helped you survive. You wake up in a world with only one kind of human. But you carry traces of the other one. You always have.